we had lived in Moose Jaw, and my boys started playing lacrosse there and just fell in love with it. They were playing hockey in the winter and lacrosse in the summer. They enjoyed the contact part of the sport and things like that. And so when we moved to Yorkton, there was no lacrosse. And, my son actually turned me on to it. He was in one of the arena, I think it was the Kinsman Arena in Yorkton, and he happened to see 2 lacrosse nets there. And he says, "Dad, there's lacrosse nets in the corner." And I said, "No, there's no lacrosse here." And he says, "Yeah, there sure is." And Kurt Kyle, who was executive director of Staffs Lacrosse, then reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you want to set lacrosse up there?" There'd been summer games played there and things like this. And, very near to you in Sturgis, there's a pretty good pool of lacrosse players there. And so, we jumped on it. And that's how it kind of happened in a lot of communities. There was Assiniboia, I'm trying to think, Estevan, Weyburn, they were trying to come into the league, say the year after we started in Yorkton and build teams. And, it was amazing. Swift Current stepped in and they're going strong. Prince Albert, a little bit more of a metro, but being that it was a little bit northern, it was tough to juggle.
Yeah, like anything, it started with some volunteers in some of those communities. Certainly there was, fortunate where, I can think of Swift Current at the time. There was Brent Wilczynski and his son Justin, who were really, I can't even remember if they had lacrosse experience, but we just had some people who were really excited about lacrosse.
I had moved to Swift Current. There was no lacrosse. Like I said, I'd played a couple games of box lacrosse previously, or one game previously, but I wanted to play lacrosse.
Yeah, a rural place I found it was a coach would move into the center or something, and then all of a sudden it would pick up. That's what happened in Yorkton. That's what happened in Assiniboia. It was one man who pretty well ran that league. Yorkton was the same way. They kind of had one guy who was like a driving force, and he pushed it on.
New to the community as in grade 11, and was talking to somebody about lacrosse, and ended up talking to an older guy that Sheldon Keebler, who had offered to coach and had played, years ago, but hadn't played lacrosse or hadn't been involved with lacrosse for years, but he had offered to coach. And so I was hoping to get a group of, some of my buddies that I played hockey with in the wintertime to play lacrosse. And so I was hoping we would, be able to find enough players that we would, practice and maybe go to a tournament and play provincials. And I was thinking field lacrosse. Sheldon was more familiar with box lacrosse, and it was just, I think, easier to coordinate and organize in Swift Current box lacrosse. So
a lot of the larger centers had very established programs or competitive programs, be it baseball or soccer. Some of the small towns don't have a lot of other opportunities. So in the spring, it was basically in a lot of these towns, think about Swift Current, Estevan was a key growing one, even Yorkton, it was almost just baseball. And a lot of these hockey players really, were more interested in trying lacrosse. So in some cases, we just had some parents who were probably harassed by their own kids and say, "Hey, can we do something with lacrosse?" So we certainly did a lot of marketing and provided a lot of support early on to those club volunteers, and we were pretty proactive in trying to find people. In some of these communities, we would target places like Swift Current, Prince Albert, Estevan. We would promote clinics. We would meet as many volunteers as we would. We had basically almost like a club startup handbook that could get going. So I would say at that point, it was a lot of great work by the Saskatchewan Lacrosse Association and its volunteers to really proactively put together programs to help some of these, rural areas, but places like Swift Current, Estevan, Assiniboia, Yorkton, Prince Albert, Big River, were all areas that we, were able to kind of work with some volunteers and start lacrosse programs all within 2 or 3 years of each other. So
it's truly a great sport, and that's what, when you brought it to those rural communities, you might have a makeshift team that had, 2 midget players and the rest was junior players that never played before, and maybe 1 or 2 guys that had picked up a stick for a couple of years, and they just fell in love with it, and you went and competed, and teams didn't always treat you any different than whether you were a great team or a weak team. You had to survive through it, and I think that's what steamrollered it, and to the success of getting an NLL team into the province has just made it what it is today.
Yeah, I would say the city teams were off to a head start because, again, a lot of them had players who had played for a number of years. Certainly, again, Regina had a program going for a long time. Moose Jaw had a program going for a long time. Saskatoon, even though maybe it was new to box, they had been playing field lacrosse for a number of years. So there was a lot of kids that, jumped over to junior box when those programs started. Yorkton, even though it maybe came in a couple of years later in the PGLL, it really was the core was from the Sturgis field lacrosse program. And again, they did have a Yorkton field lacrosse program there for a number of years as well.
No, I think it just, the cities tended to just have the stronger teams, I'd say, with the exception of, Yorkton is, I guess, technically a city, but they were always just strong because of their kind of a legacy in field lacrosse. And so they always had the lacrosse knowledge and the steady stream of players. But beyond Yorkton, it did seem that it was Saskatoon, Regina, and Moose Jaw.
When the Swift Current first joined the league, it was definitely city dominated. The league was dominated by Saskatoon, Regina, Moose Jaw teams.
The city teams in Moose Jaw were actually quite strong right away. And then we've had Swift Current in and out of the league before, just depending on how their ages graduate, right? If they have enough for the juniors. PA's been in for a long time. They were weaker at first, but they've picked up. They're quite competitive now. They could keep with almost any team in the league.
Well, the league back then was in the early stages of it. The strongest 2 teams were Saskatoon SWAT and Moose Jaw's team as well, the Mustangs. We came in. I was very, lucky in Yorkton. I'd set up lacrosse there, and in my second season, we were able to get junior going, and I was able to acquire all of the junior field players that had became too old for their league at 19 years old, and then I could keep until they were 21 playing for me. So I guess the powerhouses of the league were Saskatoon and Moose Jaw, and then when I came into the league, Yorkton, I had some, gold medal players from, national field with the Team Sask that were just outstanding players. So
I had moved to Swift Current a couple of years earlier and started the Lacrosse Association in Swift Current. So we had a lot of kids that were new to the sport, new to the game, and we were learning. I'd moved to Swift Current and only played one box lacrosse game prior to starting the association there. And so it was interesting in that I don't know if we truly knew what we were getting ourselves into. It was a group in Swift Current those early years that were really good athletes. A lot come from hockey background. And we were just going out and, just running as hard as we could because we had a lot of skill to make up for compared to some of the teams from the city.
But yes, traditionally, the teams, when you were setting up in the rural communities, you didn't have, that pool of talented athletes to draw from. And most of it was, in the early stages of setting up. So I remember, and I actually ran into it here in Alberta. I coached a little bit of lacrosse, junior lacrosse in Fort McMurray, and you're playing a junior team that has 19 and 21-year-olds on it, with half your team being midget players, and that's what happened in a lot of cases. But yes, traditionally the urban ones were a little stronger because they just had a little bit more talent to draw from.
It wasn't, Saskatoon and Regina had a bigger base to draw from. So, definitely it wasn't that they were weak by any means, but they just didn't have the base to draw from. I mean, Big River, that's a small community. They were drawing players out of Prince Albert and surrounding areas. And it just so happened that Blampin, was in Ontario and had been involved in lacrosse out there. So, when we were talking about it, it was an instant win for him. But, their team struggled, without a doubt. But they tried hard, they worked hard. They're all farm boys. So, you weren't going to mess around with them too much, because they'd take and hang a licking on you right away if you, got too cocky about it. But, they played well and tried hard. And, as the leagues grew and as the association started to grow, it always became that way, where it was a little bit of struggle for some of the smaller communities to, keep their teams going and getting enough quality athletes to, be serious and compete with the larger associations.
As somebody said once, the center has to develop novice up. Right. So your novice players have to eventually become junior players, and that's how you maintain a really good competitive league. Right. So, for a while we had Assiniboia in the league, but they literally had a 4-year to 5-year group of kids. And once they graduated out of junior, there was just nothing left. Right. So they split into Moose Jaw or other areas. But
playing in some of the small towns, it really was a big deal for those communities, and the support those smaller communities got.
Well, they were always well supported by their communities, and you were always intimidated when you walked in the barn. Like I said before, they were tough players, and they weren't going to back down from you. They weren't going to take it easy on you for sure. So you had to work hard and continuously push to even get any kind of gains on them. So it was always exciting to show up in Big River and playing against the boys up there and the crowd and everything else that was out there. Assiniboia, one game they had lots of people at. The next game they were a little bit weaker. More of a farming community with the everything going on with the spring and fall with seeding and everything else that goes on, so at times they had, trouble bringing in people, but it was always exciting being in the barn there in Assiniboia and playing those games.
The crowd and the energy level of, showing up in those communities for a game. Big River, I'll never forget. That was, it was, a long bus drive. What I remember, that was our very first game in the PGLL for the Swift Current Rampage. And to that point, the players on our team had never played outside of each other in Swift Current. I think we had myself and 1 or 2 others that had played lacrosse previous to the year before when we had started things in Swift Current. And we spent, all that time driving up to Big River. And I can't even remember if it's a 6-hour bus drive or whatever it is, but it's a long one. And everybody's sitting on the bus, not knowing exactly what we were getting ourselves into, what type of competition it would be, what the flow of the game really looked like, when it happened in Swift Current so organically, when we're only playing ourselves, things kind of just developed. And, we were that first year in Swift Current playing just, house league, if you will. It was what worked, what we had for athletes. But now all of a sudden stepping out onto the floor against another team that knew how to play and knew how to play a lot more organized, it was something. I can tell you there was a lot of players on that bus that were very nervous for that very first shift. And
a lot of our games were lopsided. I think back to one of our first games against Regina. Regina came out and the Pebberdys were there, and I just remember Bruce looking out, and my guys are all warming up, and he sees all the green and yellow helmets on there, and he looks at me, he goes, "Those are all your guys?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "They all got National Field Lacrosse helmets on, Team Sask helmets on." And I go, "Yeah, I'm pretty lucky." And he looks at me, he goes, "Can you take it easy on me?" And I think that game, it was like 21-4. But, a lot of games were lopsided like that. But when it came down to the playoffs, I can remember battling it out against Barry Stewart and Moose Jaw, and it was down to us. And we were the first team that in 9 years that had beat him.
And, that game, we ended up winning. And but that's one game that I'll never forget. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, but we had a very athletic group and a group that worked very hard.
There's a million stories, and it was probably the best time of my life. My wife and I co-founded it in Yorkton, and we lived at the rink, and very similar to Randy Troback, and that you're going to make it and survive no matter what, and you're going to give it your all to do it. And
well, it's interesting. I went to a conference, actually. Sask Lacrosse sent me to Ottawa for a national officials conference, and there was the NHL was there, the NBA, the NFL, all of their officials were there. And they were all kind of pondering the question of why we lose officials at this certain age group. And then, of course, the topic came up the same thing with players, right? I mean, hockey loses a ton from midget to junior, right? Others, it's the same for us too. We lose a ton from midget to our junior graduations. And there was tons of factors thrown around by different groups. Like they were saying, oh, well, it's basically, kids get more diverse as they get older. And if they're not going to continue on the A stream, which is like the chance for a college scholarship, or some kids just don't want to play anymore and then they just quit. Other people say it's jobs, because that's your job age now, right? All of a sudden these kids are getting jobs. So making money versus playing a sport where you're paying to play, right? So I think it's a combination, really. We have the same problem with officials. We usually keep them till they're 18 or 19 and then they're done. They'll usually quit. So we might keep them for 5 years or 4 years, and then they just quit. So,
well, I think the reason any sport or program, whether it's a small city, a small center, or even a city, has challenges continuing or sustaining is again relating to volunteers.
It's the volunteers, right? I mean, they work hard and they move up. They tend to move up, with their players and.
Well, it really depends on the volunteer base that you have.
It's tough when you're not drawing in the younger kids to continue playing, or is the community maybe getting a little older? Those are the tough things when you're in smaller based communities, and you continue to have to work at it. And sometimes there's not much you can do. I mean, if there's not a lot of youth in the smaller community, it's tough to build youth teams and groups, right? So
you certainly need a core of volunteers to keep anything going. And also, again, you need that core of athletes, and, numbers in certainly some areas of Saskatchewan over the last 20 years, even though we've seen maybe a little bit of a retracement lately, population was typically declining in a lot of these areas, especially as far as the youth is concerned. So
you just don't have that history of people being involved in the game. I know when we started Swift Current, it was, all volunteers and very few people within the community that had played the game before. And so your coaches, your referees, the people that have had that experience and understand the game and know the finer details of the game, you just don't have that in the smaller communities.
It's not anybody's fault, right? I think it's just the reality of small town Saskatchewan is you probably just don't have a lot of people around that can play. So if you have certain years, you get lucky and you have a good group of people and there's enough of them, it works. And then other years it just doesn't. And so it's tough to really kind of build serious momentum when it kind of does that.
You're starting to get some parents and whatnot that have played or had played previously involved, and that helps big time.
But honestly, once a kid picks up that stick, they want to have it there. So if your volunteer base is strong, you'll always have the kids, and that's what we found. But we drove it ourselves. My wife and I and our family, we drove it, and that's what it was all about. I think that was, it was hard for people to step in our shoes because we did everything, whether it be fixing goalie equipment in the middle of a tournament or whatever it may be. We were there to try and make sure that those kids had the best experience they possibly could have.